I hate box players. Well, I actually think I just hate losing to box players, but hear me out. There is just something about losing to someone who is playing on a controller that was designed to be awesome at Melee, while I'm out here playing on a controller designed 20 years ago, designed for Mario to jump on a Goomba? These types of controllers are becoming way more common, and I can't even remember the last time I went to an event where someone wasn't playing on a controller like this. Furthermore, some of these players are actually getting pretty good. A box player named Pipsqueak became the first player on a box to defeat probably the most popular player of all time, Mango. However, I have some hope for you. I spent a bunch of time talking to box players about all the things that are actually surprisingly difficult to do on a box controller than you would expect compared to a GameCube controller. Things that used to be second nature, such as walking in Super Smash Bros, is kind of a pain when doing it or learning it on a box. I've talked to so many players about these struggles, and I asked them questions about what's hard for them to do. They think I'm making a video of how to learn how to play on a box controller. But what they don't know is I'm actually making a video showing you how to exploit their weaknesses and show you exactly how to beat a player who plays on a box controller. In this video, I'm going to show you a bunch of different ways you can exploit the characteristics of a box to get an upper edge against your opponent next time you play one. The first thing I want to talk about are up B angles, particularly with Fox and Falco. When you're below stage, Fox and Falco will use what we call an up B attack. This up B attack has countless different angles that you can choose from where you can just get to where you're trying to get to. But on a box, this is actually way more complicated and way more limited. In fact, up Bing is such a pain in the butt, it manifests in a couple of different habits. The first way is if they're new to up B angles in general, they'll often choose to side B instead of up Bing to stage, which means you can actually learn to exploit that. By staying parallel to your opponent, you can actually just take advantage and anticipate where your opponent might side B to. The second way this manifests is when a player has recently learned how to use up B angles. What usually happens is that they overuse it for some reason and they'll just up B straight to ledge almost every time. You can exploit this by just getting to ledge right before they do, and they'll end up dying most of the time. As Fox players learn how to recover with a box, you'll notice that they'll tend to just learn where to fall and then base their angle based on that. That's actually pretty predictable and basically tells you exactly where they're going to go before they're even going to get there. Ledge dashing. One of the more popular traits of the box is that it produces fast, consistent, and long ledge dashes. This can be a nightmare to play against. However, when box players are just learning how to do a ledge dash, they'll usually just go with the longest ledge dash length that's available on a box. Just as how a box can produce consistent ledge dashes, it also gives you a consistent way to space around a ledge dash. What's important to note here is that the box can only produce a handful of ledge dash options. That means new players will typically just learn the one that gets them the furthest. However, as annoying and deadly that is, there is still some hope. By learning exactly how far a max length box ledge dash can get you, you can just space right outside of it. This gives a somewhat consistent way of beating a ledge dash attack and forces your opponent to either A, not do it, or B, probably just do something totally else. This is generally a good tip in general in Melee, but it's extra consistent when playing against box players. Shield control. With a box controller, controlling your shield is actually way more difficult. I'm talking about shield angling and turning your shield from small to light to hard and in between. On the controllers, it's pretty easy to just make a snap decision and adjust your shield accordingly. But on a box, it usually requires a sequence of buttons that might not be the fastest thing to memorize. For example, shield pokes. They seem to happen way more often against box players than controllers. If a box player does not know immediately how to handle a shield situation, they're more likely to get poked from behind, below, or above. And if they're just holding onto shield longer than necessary, then you have a bunch of different ways to take advantage and find a way to shield poke your opponent. At higher levels of play, better players will just angle their shield to cover anything you're trying to poke. But against box players, that is not a second nature, and you'll realize that shield pokes just happen a little bit more against box players than maybe your average controller player. On that topic, we should talk about shield dropping. On a controller, a box controller, Shield dropping is pretty easy, especially if you're running, shielding, and then dropping. However, if you are just shielding on a platform already, to shield drop on a box requires a somewhat awkward sequence of buttons that if you don't do perfectly, you're gonna get locked out or you're gonna do something you don't wanna do. I've heard that the hand position for this can be a little bit awkward, so you might notice that your opponent will just start messing this up a little bit more often. Basically, all that I'm saying is that you might be able to confidently attack a shielded box player a little bit more than you would, say, attack someone just waiting for shield on a controller. Situational awareness. There's a couple situations in Melee that you could take advantage of a little bit differently when your opponent is playing on a box controller compared to a normal GameCube controller. The first one is meteor canceling. This is a technique where you can stop your downward momentum when an opponent hits you with like a downwards air attack usually. For some reason, box players tend to mess up this technique a little bit more frequently than controller players. Personally, I think it's because due to the relative infrequency of the situation, the awkward buttons needed to be pressed, and the quick reaction time means that box players just mess this up a little bit more. Furthermore, if they do manage to meteor cancel correctly, they'll probably be in an awkward spot when recovering, meaning you can probably take advantage of their suboptimal way back onto the stage. Another situational tip is when you're being wave shined by a Fox player on a box. That rhymed. Without getting too detailed, you have an opportunity to SDI in or away from a wave shine combo. If you were to SDI outwards on a wave shine combo by someone who's playing on a controller, it forces them to do something that's difficult, but not really impossible technique to manage to continue comboing you. However, if you SDI away from a box player, it is actually just way more burdensome for them to incorporate this technique, basically making them walk in between wave shines, which for some reason, walking is just way more difficult to do on a box controller. So if you want to make your box opponent's life really hard, SDI away from their wave shine, then you'll basically force them to do a ton more work just for this combo to work. So as I've talked to all these box players, a common trend started to appear. Basically, all the offensive stuff, such as shield pressure, combos, and crazy flashy movement, is way easier and a lot more fun to practice on a box. On the other hand, the defensive maneuvers are way more complicated usually in a box and way less fun to practice. This kind of creates players who are a monster on offense, but are a little bit lacking on the defense. They have to work so much harder once they're put on the defense. And I don't think I'm good enough to tell you how to get a box player on the defense, but once you do, you can make them a lot more nervous and make them work a lot harder just to keep up with you if you manage to get on the offense. If you put them in the corner enough with offensive pressure, you might find some box players, especially new ones, will just start to crumble. All that to say, if you're up against an experienced box player, a lot of these tips might not work out. But I have a dirty little secret. Most box players are new box players. The box controller is still relatively new and not that easy to get a hold of. So chances are, when your opponent sits down and they're holding a box controller, they're probably pretty new at it, which means a lot of these tips might actually be useful to you. With that said, let me know if you have any other concepts or ideas, leave them in the comments and I would love to read them. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.